guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. She had every comfort money could buy and none of the tenderness a child needs. The house glittered like a museum, and Emma sat in rooms that swallowed her smallness until even her shadow felt lost. She suffered every day, until the new maid found something horrifying in her hair, and then nothing in that house would ever be the same. If this story moves you, please stay, like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The stone estate stood on a clipped lawn that caught the light like a coin. Inside, chandeliers spilled cold pools of light over marble floors and portraits of generations who had never known want. It was the kind of place that announced itself before you reached the heavy doors. Machines hummed, staff moved like rehearsed shadows, and stillness had settled into the corners like dust. Emma's footsteps were too soft for that house. They made no sound against the long corridors, and that silence taught her how to be invisible. Emma was 7, with hair the color of wheat left in the sun and a small mouth that rarely formed complaints. She liked to draw houses with windows full of light and people who held hands, and she tucked those drawings away in a cardboard box under her narrow bed. The box squeaked when she pulled it out, a small, secret sound, and in that box the pictures stayed like promises she wasn't allowed to trust. Her world was measured in rituals she made up to answer the absence. Heart-shaped pancakes on Saturdays she burned herself to impress a memory, whispering hello to the portraits as if they could teach her how to be seen, arranging dolls on the armchair to keep each other company. After her mother's funeral, the estate changed in ways that had nothing to do with furniture. Richard Stone moved through the days as if he were traveling in fog, conducting calls from a study where the curtains stayed closed. Work became a map he followed to avoid the rooms where his wife's laugh used to be. Mrs. Crawford, who had the house's keys and the gift of a perfectly controlled jaw, supervised the staff with the certainty of someone who knew that rules were a kind of salvation. She kept schedules and budgets and a strict list of acceptable behaviors. Children to her were tasks to be managed. Emma became, in Mrs. Crawford's ledger, an item whose inconvenience needed to be minimized. Maria arrived a month into the new year, a live-in housekeeper with a small bag and a cape of quiet determination. She had learned to cut hair in the back room of a salon where the radio always played folk songs, and she kept a tin of combs and a jar of herbal oil in her trunk. Her mother was sick 2 hours away. The money from this post would pay for medicine and treatments. Maria had not expected to fall in love with the child she was paid to care for, but affection is not always a choice. The scalp under the hair was visible in places, patches of redness, tiny scabs that Anna would later call sores, a sheen of irritation that told a story of scratching and shame. Maria's hands steadied like a surgeon's. She would later tell herself she did what anyone who cared would do. She took the child to the heated, private kitchen where the house staff ate, placed a soft towel around Emma's shoulders, and set a basin of warm water on the table. She worked slowly, because panic does no good with knots in children's hair. She used oil, a simple, fragrant mix she'd learned to make in the salon, and began to coax the strands apart with her fingers. Fingers were better than combs when the hair clung together like reluctant companions. Emma squeezed the rabbit until the fabric creased her small knuckles.
When Mrs. Crawford learned that Maria had unbound Emma's ribbon in the kitchen, she came with the precision of an inspector. Her voice was low and efficient. "We have a schedule. Children should be presentable. You must be careful, Maria. Mr. Stone, he does not like surprises." "It isn't about presentability," Maria said. "It's about her skin. I think—" Her voice slipped under the sweep of Mrs. Crawford's disapproval. "There's redness. She's been scratching." Mrs. Crawford's mouth thinned. "She is a child. She will outgrow certain habits. We cannot make a scene over every little thing meant to be private." Maria felt something inside her go taut. This was not an argument about towels. It was an argument about whether a child's pain could be ignored by a house that had everything. She wrapped the towel, finished the gentle detangling she could manage at the table, and when Emma's hair revealed more of the scalp, a pattern of little abrasions and what looked like tiny gray specks near the roots, Maria made a decision. She knocked on the study door where Mr. Stone worked. The knock should have been gentle, but by the time the door opened, her voice carried every hour of sleeplessness she had held for her mother. Richard looked up from his desk as if he had interrupted the last chord of a symphony he hadn't realized he'd been conducting from the grave. He was thinner than the portraits, with tired lines at the corners of his eyes, and a suit that always had the exact crease of someone who never slept soundly. "Mr. Stone," Maria said, without waiting for permission, because there was no time for patience when a child was suffering. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Emma needs to see someone. Look at her scalp." He followed her to the kitchen, where Emma sat under the warm lamplight like a rescued sparrow. His face closed in at the sight of the child's head. He knelt as if the floor had become suddenly soft, the way people do when they can no longer stand the distance between themselves and what they love.
Maria watched the armor peel from him, the precise executive who had outsourced grief to his calendar, now face to face with the small human consequence of absence. Richard didn't shout or scold. He made a sound like a broken thing. He wanted to ask how long. He wanted to accuse Mrs. Crawford, to call himself every name of a father who had failed. What came out was something else, a raw, unpracticed apology hanging between them like a small, humble gift. "I didn't," he began, and then the words ran out. For a moment he sat down, the chair making a scratch at the tiled floor, and the children's clock in the corner ticked too loudly. The mansion's music quieted to a brittle hush. "We need help," Maria said. "She needs a specialist. This isn't something for the house nurse." He nodded. People who had planned the trajectories of ships and deals know how to act when their routine breaks. They act quickly. A phone call, instructions clipped into the air, a pass to the car waiting at the servant's entrance. He moved with friction, the grief and the guilt folding into a speed that was almost panicked. Mrs. Crawford arrived in the doorway as they prepared to leave. She opened her mouth to protest, to remind them of schedules and appearances. But Richard's eyes found hers like a compass needle finding north, and there was no patience left in his face for anything but the child. He said, "Find her things," and it was not a request. The drive to the salon was a small shock of ordinary life. The car prowled down the private lane, hedges cutting shadows on the leather seats. In the back, Emma curled inward like a folded letter. Maria kept one hand on her knee. Richard sat in the front, jaw working. His knuckles were pale against the wheel. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was a rough whisper of someone learning how to be present for the first time in a long while. They went first to Sophia's salon, because Maria trusted her.
Sophia ran a small place 2 towns over, warm and cluttered with jars of creams and a wall mirror that had the gentle patina of people who'd spent decades helping others reveal themselves. She greeted them with the calm of someone who had seen many kinds of hair and many kinds of lives. When Emma sat under the salon's soft light, the air smelled of conditioner and lemon oil. The contrast between the salon's cozy hum and the mansion's hush made Emma blink. Sophia's trained hands examined the scalp as if reading a map. She did not gasp. She did not dramatize. She used phrases that were precise and kind. "There's matting," she said, "and signs of infestation and irritation. We can detangle, but it will take time. We'll need to be gentle. It may be painful, so we must go slowly. After that, a medical check, antibiotics if there's infection, and follow-up care." Richard listened as if each sentence were a small rope pulling him back to shore.
Em seu era narrado loísmo rope pulling him back to shore. He had known enough about illness to know he was not a specialist. He had to trust those who were. He put his hands forward and rested them near Emma as if to say, "I'm here." Sophia prepared the station. A bowl of warm water, a pot of oil warmed to body temperature, clamps, a wide-toothed comb, jars labeled with treatments. She explained every step to Emma in a voice that made room for fear. "We will make you comfortable," she promised. "I will not rush you. We will work together." Maria sat on a low stool and began the long, patient work she had trained for in corners of crowded salons. She started at the tips and worked toward the roots. Oil loosened the knots like sunlight unfreezing a small river. Fingers traced tangles apart. The process demanded a rhythm of steadiness: unstick, loosen, separate. Every so often, Emma flinched and then settled, sensing that these were hands that would not hurt her intentionally, but would press where it was necessary to right a wrong. Outside the salon, Richard walked the block twice. He phoned his assistant with decisions that felt clumsy next to the saloon's focused care. He asked where his wife's jewelry was. He asked about the arrangements he had made for Emma's schooling. He asked how long she would need to be at the salon. None of those questions mattered compared to the one that had begun to break him. Why had he not known? When he returned and sat quietly in the corner, the man in the tailored coat looked like someone stooping to pick up a life he'd once defined by its edges. He held himself small, as if shame had taught him physical humility. Emma, meanwhile, watched him with the new, fast curiosity of a child who had always wanted a native to her own country of attention. Sophia worked with the patience of someone who has seen trauma reveal itself as tangles, and knows that haste only makes knots worse. Her hands moved in long motions. Maria hummed a low tune to anchor Emma. The saloon's clock went around once, twice. The work grew intimate in a way that made the three of them feel like conspirators against neglect. At a point, as oil loosened the densest patches, gray specks fell like tiny, embarrassed things from the roots. Maria's throat tightened. Sophia's face remained composed. "This is delicing," she said quietly. "It's not something to be ashamed of, though I know the child may feel that way. We will rid her hair of them, then we'll treat the skin." Richard could not do anything useful except sit with his hands folded and watch someone else do the work of repair. Watching, however, is a kind of lesson. He watched how Maria whispered encouragements and how Emma, once frightened, started to breathe easier as each knot opened. The man whose days had been measured in portfolios now measured time by the small victories of a child's comfort. When the last heavy knot came away and Sophia wrapped a warm towel around Emma's shoulders, the child's hair sagged damp and straighter than before.
There were patches where hair had thinned, the scalp showed, a pale quilt of sensitive skin. Sophia's tone was practical. "We saved most of it," she said, "but we need a doctor's evaluation. There may be infection. We must act now." Richard lifted his gaze like a man recovering from sleep. "Hospital?" he asked, voice small. "Emergency room," Maria said. "For antibiotics, and to be sure there's no deeper infection. We must not delay." The three of them left for the hospital with the motion of a rescue. In the waiting room, sharp fluorescent light replaced the salon's warmth, and the air smelled of antiseptic and coffee. A nurse took Emma's vitals with the brisk kindness of someone who performs comfort as a learned trade. A doctor examined the scalp with a lamp and asked questions in a calm cadence. After a brief consultation, the verdict was firm. Begin antibiotics, topical treatments for the skin, and a schedule of follow-ups. The wounds were not catastrophic, the doctor said, but they were real and required attention. Early treatment, she told Richard, prevents deeper problems. Children should be watched closely. Richard signed forms with hands that trembled. Paperwork in a hospital made him feel helpless in a way board meetings never did. He sat with Emma while medication was administered and felt his chest unclench in the small acts of staying. She put her head on his knee with the kind of trust that takes time to earn and yet sometimes returns in a heartbeat when a parent chooses to stay. When they returned to the estate, the house seemed to have changed its angle slightly, as if the walls themselves had learned something. Mrs. Crawford met them at the door, a clipboard in hand. Her face showed a careful neutrality. "We will need documentation," she said. Richard looked up from where he steadied Emma. He had spent the drive home rehearsing what he didn't know how to say. He knew he could fire someone. He knew schedules could be rewritten. He also knew that for months he had outsourced the small attentions that had once been part of his practice. He walked through the rooms he had once walked like a ghost, and found in himself the worry that perhaps this thing, this child's damaged scalp, was a symptom of his absence. "She will not return to Mrs. Crawford's direct care," he said at last, and his voice did not carry the flat corporate tone it used to. It was uneven, but it was present. "I want Maria to stay with Emma during recovery." Mrs. Crawford's eyes had a thin, stunned flash. "Mr. Stone, No," he interrupted, not unkindly but not weakly. "Find her other employment. And prepare a schedule that prioritizes Emma's follow-ups. I will adjust my meetings." The house's machinery of order had been upended by a simple thing, a parent who chose to look. Consequences fell into place with the quiet inevitability of weather. Mrs. Crawford packed a small valise and left with the same measured poise she had used to rule the staff.
The estate hired nurses and arranged visits. Most of all, Richard began, haltingly at first, to make room in his calendar for a ritual he had not practiced since his wife's death. Maria's choice to stay was practical and moral. Her mother still needed medicine, and this job offered more than money. It offered meaning. She became more than a housekeeper. She taught Emma small braiding patterns. She arranged drawings on the refrigerator of a kitchen that did not exist. And she watched like a guardian as the child's hair healed. Sophia made fortnightly visits to treat the scalp and trim dead ends. The professional care saved more hair than anyone had dared hope. Nightly, after dinners that Richard now sometimes sat through,
He found himself sitting on the edge of Emma's bed, a kettle of warm oil and a soft brush at his side. The ritual began awkwardly. His fingers were clumsy. The brush caught once, and Emma winced. He stopped, breath held, and tried again. Maria would often stand in the doorway with a quiet smile, as if she had been waiting to see if the house could be taught new habits. The brush, at first a foreign object in his hand, became a small instrument of repair. Emma's hair took months to settle into health. Some strands had thinned, a pale map of what had happened, but most grew back, encouraged by antibiotics and careful tending. The child watched with a small, astonished reserve as Hans, first Maria's, then Richard's, learned the patience of grooming. The nightly brushing became their way of talking without words. Richard would speak in the intervals between strokes, stories about his own childhood, about his wife's penchant for blue scarves, about mistakes he could not undo. Emma would answer with the soft relish of a child who has reclaimed attention. A question, a drawing slid under his fingers, a sleepy smile. One evening, as autumn leaned toward winter, Emma placed a drawing on Richard's pillow. It showed a house with light in every window, and two figures standing on the porch, one taller than the other, each holding a brush. At the bottom she wrote, in letters a bit too big, "Happy." He looked at it until the lines blurred with the tears he would not admit to then. Later, when she drifted to sleep, he sat longer by the side of the bed, and brushed until the room was only the sound of bristles through hair, and the quiet proof that someone had come home. There were conversations about responsibility that he didn't want to have but had to, about the yard staff, about oversight, about how a house with everything could forget to look. He replaced Mrs. Crawford's directives with a new kind of order, a list of appointments, a nurse's number on his phone, a promise to pick Emma up from school, and to attend her recitals, no matter how small. He spoke with his board and arranged for a sabbatical of sorts, less to escape work than to do the work of being a father. Maria's promotion was quiet.
She asked for the title nanny, as if it were a currency she had earned, and Richard gave it to her with a gratitude he could not compress into words. Sophia's regulars would sometimes see her in the salon and ask about the child with the golden hair who had taught a billionaire how to be present. The story, when told in small pockets of town, lost nothing and yet was not the kind of tale that sought attention. Its miracle was not a headline. It was a ritual, the steady stroke of a brush. There was, however, a night that remained for Richard like a dividing line between who he had been and who he would be. It was the first time he watched Emma sleep without aching to escape into the safety of work. He had tucked her in, brushed her hair until it shone under the lamp, and sat until the house's clocks sounded like a congregation. Emma opened her eyes and, with the child's sudden candor, whispered, "I'm glad it happened." He blinked hard, not understanding at first the odd twist of gratitude wrapped in such small words. "What do you mean?" he asked. She traced a small heart on his palm with a fingertip. "Because you came back," she said. "If none of that had happened, maybe you would have stayed in that other room forever. I like when you brush my hair." Richard felt something like sunlight after winter. He laughed, a small sound that trembled in the air. "I like brushing your hair too," he said, and meant it in a way that would be remembered as truth. The house continued to gleam with the same, shall we say, certainty, but now its glow reflected different things. Drawings bloomed on the refrigerator. There was now a box of children's cups in the pantry where there had only been crystal. The echoing halls learned to carry the sound of small boots and the soft thud of a storybook closing.
Maria, who still called home to ask if her mother had taken her medicine, had in turn become the person Emma reached for when a dream unsettled her. She taught Emma the braid that made morning simpler, the braid that could be done before breakfast when time was thin. In the months that followed, health appointments became routine and then memory. Richard found himself at school plays, at a dentist appointment, on a rainy day letting Emma choose which umbrella they would use. He discovered in the detours of daily care an unexpected kind of pleasure, the ordinary smallness that collected into a life. He still missed his wife as one misses a particular light, but grief found a new shape, one that allowed room for presence rather than a retreat into absence. There were practical consequences, too. Mrs. Crawford's dismissal circulated among staff like a change in weather. The estate instituted new oversight, hired additional caregivers, and set mandatory check-ins. No legal melodrama followed. The moral correction was both immediate and sufficient for the story that needed to be told inside those walls. One evening, after a bath that left the house smelling faintly of lavender and lemon, Emma curled up on the couch with Maria and Richard. A fire burned with a tame, steady light. She turned to Richard and offered him a braid she had made with her small hands. "For you," she said, and handed it to him like a small, woven treaty. He accepted it with the solemnity of someone who had learned that small things are everything. He braided his fingers around it, let the scent of clean hair and childhood seep into his palms, and promised, in the only way that matters, to be present the next day and the day after that. The house, which had once been a grand museum of absence, now kept the quieter, fuller collection of a family learning to stay. In the new pattern of the house, decisions were small and consequential. They arrived in the afternoons, in the way someone put down a cup, in the names they used for each other across a corridor. A month after the braid, Maria came to Richard with a folded piece of paper held between two fingers like a fragile thing. They sat at the kitchen table. The paper was a letter from a woman who ran a small training room in a neighborhood that had once been merely a place on the other side of town to Maria. She had written that she admired the steadiness Maria showed with Emma and with her mother, that she wanted someone of Maria's hands and temper to come and learn to work professionally with hair, cuts, treatments, the sort of care that paid and was recognized as craft. It was an offer of apprenticeship and, if all went well, a share in the little shop's earnings. Maria had not put the letter down at once. She had carried it with her through pill counts and bus rides, turning the possibility in her palm like a small coin. To Richard, it was as if the house itself were being invited to breathe beyond its walls. "You don't have to decide today," Richard said, feeling at once clumsy and eager. He wanted to say the right thing, how grateful they were, how indebted. He imagined himself producing a check, securing her nights, drafting a contract that would make the gratitude official and tidy. Maria smiled, but her smile was not for thanks. "I know," she said. "I don't want charity, Mr. Crawford. I want to work. I want to learn the things I have taught myself because I had to. You gave me a chance to save, to be careful with money, to do right by my mother. This is another chance." There was in her a refusal to be reduced to being merely useful. She would not be the household's penitent reward. She loved Emma. That love had braided itself into her decisions, but it did not unmake the rest of her life. The letter was proof that Maria held other selves. Daughter of a mother who had been tended, a woman with a craft, a person with a future that was not simply a continuation of service. "I could keep helping here," she went on, watching the steam rise from her tea. Once, on an afternoon when the estate smelled of new-mown grass and lemon from Maria's cleaning, a neighbor's child came by with a scraped knee and a story about being left on a bench. The child had something of Emma's earlier look, a small, puzzled trust, as if the world were expected to deliver care and once failed. Maria took the child into the kitchen, washed the scratch, and bandaged it with the same attention she had given Emma months before. Richard watched from the doorway, a plate in his hand, and felt no shame then, only the kind of gratitude that is not indebted, but generous, the wish that the house be a place where hands knew how to do what needed doing. There were still evenings when the past pressed against the windows, the old absence like a cold draft. Sometimes Richard would wake at night with a memory of a conversation untouched or a meeting missed, and the old voice of guilt would try to drown out the present. He had learned how to bring himself back. A walk by the gardens, a small letter to Maria when needed, an apology uttered and then demonstrated by a simple act, fixing a broken toy, sitting through a recital, learning the time to let a child climb into his lap. Maria flourished at the apprenticeship. She learned new techniques and names for things she had long done by instinct. The woman who taught her praised her steadiness and the tenderness she brought to a head of hair. In the evenings, she brought home small, careful accounts of the day, a list of improvements, or an idea for a cut she thought might suit. Sometimes she braided Emma's hair in a style that made the little girl sit very still. Other times, Emma braided Maria, sitting on the floor with knees tucked, concentrating as if making a promise. The household's oversight committee, administrators of the estate's new rules, visited now and then, not to accuse, but to ensure that the little life inside was secure. Their presence was a new sort of accountability, less theatrical, more administrative. They approved schedules and left with a kind of relieved professionalism. It was not justice, it was a structure that made harm less likely. For Richard, it was a reminder that goodness often required scaffolding as well as will. On a late afternoon in early autumn, when the light had the thin slant of cooler days, Emma brought Richard another braid she had made. It was longer now, her hair catchable in a soft rope. She handed it to him with a solemnity that had become ritual, and he, perhaps more than any speech, understood. "Thank you," she said, with the same small voice as before. But the tone had changed. It was not the fragile gratitude of a child rescued. It was the quiet competence of someone who knew the world now bent around her too. Richard kissed her, felt the braid in his fingers, and knew that the work was not ended. Love was not a moment. It was a continuing appointment.
He thought of Maria teaching, of a shop in another quarter, of the small pride that sat in the kitchen like a companion. He thought of his own father, of mistakes that had widened like riverbeds, and of the slow, patient labor of filling them. Outside, the estate hedges cast long, cool shadows. The brush on the mantel caught a strip of light and gleamed. Inside, the house no longer pretended absence was a virtue. It had become a place that kept what was small and important safe, and that, in itself, felt like a kind of miracle. The future would arrive with its own edges and demands. They would meet it in the ordinary way families do, together, with hands that knew how to mend. The fair came on a Sunday that smelled of dust and frying oil and the faint, sweet smoke of sausages. Stalls lined the walk, hung with buntings Maria had stitched the week before, and laughter moved in quick, bright skiffs across the grass. Emma woke with the light already in her hair, eyes wide as if she had slept on the brim of a new thing. She chose a dress that wanted to be twirled in. She insisted, stubborn and delighted, on wearing 2 different ribbons, one for Maria, one for Richard. Richard dressed slowly, with the precise ritual he had taught himself. The watch that did not show off, the tie he knotted without a glance, the coat buttoned in the middle where it did the job of keeping warmth close.
He noticed how ordinary it felt to be careful about time, to arrive early because Emma liked to see the stalls set out, to stay late because she would ask for one more turn on the carousel. There was no grand pronouncement that he had changed, only the small calibrations of a life that had learned the weight of small things. They walked together under a sun that kept wanting to be generous. Maria carried their bundle of sandwiches and an extra sweater for Emma. Richard took Emma's hand the way one steadies someone crossing a shallow stream, careful and silent. At the green, neighbors that had once been polite and distant nodded as she passed, and some stopped to greet Maria by name. The estate had loosened into a neighborhood. Acts of care no longer had to be announced as proof. At the center of the fair, there was a stage for children's performances. Emma insisted on sitting near the front. When small voices trembled into songs, when a boy in oversized trousers recited a poem about the river and benediction, Emma watched like a judge who had not been asked to decide, but whose opinion mattered anyway. Richard found a place at the edge of the crowd and let his presence speak rather than his words. A mother pressed a grateful look toward him, and he returned it with a nod that meant simply, "I am here." Midway through the afternoon, over the murmur of conversation and the clink of cups, a child's cry tore out, sharp and particular. People turned.
A little boy, not more than 5, staggered across the grass. His knee scraped and his face collapsed around the rawness of surprise. He had been separated from his mother, who, white-faced and breathless, called his name and scoured the crowd. The sight made something old and tender rise in Richard, memory of days when he had not known how to stand patient before a child's panic. Before he could think of the right words, Maria had stepped forward. She wiped the boy's blood with the same steadiness she had cultivated on Emma's head, and then, without fanfare, guided him to the first aid table where bandages were kept. Emma, who had seen the scene and understood it in an adult way, held out her own ribbon to the child as if offering part of her own steadiness. The mother found him and clutched him to her, and the crowd uncoiled into relief. Later, when Richard and Maria walked home with a small bag of toffee and the dusk softening the hedges, he realized he had watched the event not as an accused man looking for ways to defend himself, but as someone who had been given a model to imitate. He had been given the truth that presence could be learned. He had learned it well enough to see it functioning in others and to take comfort rather than dread from that knowledge. In the weeks that followed, life held its usual mixture of small appointments and sudden gentle emergencies. Maria received a letter, handwritten, inviting her to staff a small corner in a market a few blocks away. The woman who ran the stall had seen Maria braid at the fair and had been struck by the lightness and quiet patience of her hands. It was not wealth or renown. It was a modest opportunity to earn a steadier wage and to teach others who walked in with hair like flags and hands unsure how to reach. Maria hesitated, then said yes. Richard, who had watched her hands make order of hair and afternoons and small griefs, felt a pride that had nothing to do with him. He found new steadiness as well. The estate's grounds required a caretaker, someone to tend the hedges, to keep the path clear of litter, to oil the gate. It was not a job of status, but it rewarded him in the same currency he had been learning to value: the visible, measurable making sure of things. He kept the schedule the committee required,
and in the mornings he worked with a quiet devotion that felt like a prayer. When a storm tore at a branch and it lay across the lane, he was there with rope and saw. When tiles loosened from a roof, he climbed up and set them right again. His hands remembered the work of mending in other spheres, and this was a kind of penance that translated into usefulness rather than self-flagellation. The committee still visited, but visits had lost their theatrical terror. They asked questions about routines, about Emma's sleep, about Maria's workshop hours. They recorded their notes and left signatures in their tiny ledger.
Their presence was like scaffolding around a building, necessary and often unseen when the structure was sound. Richard learned to welcome the committee's neatness, to appreciate the way rules could cradle rather than cage. Winter arrived with a softness, thin frost in the mornings, the glow of lamps earlier in the dusk. Emma learned to skate on the little pond that had once been a place where he had stood outside the day. She fell once, then again, and each time she got back up with a quickness that made Richard laugh in spite of the cold. Maria wrapped tea for them in a thermos and watched from a bench, knitting a scarf whose colors seemed picked from the bulbs of the garden. The house collected guests for simple meals, neighbors bringing stews, children borrowing a cup of sugar, the woman from the market visiting with a box of dried flowers. The house that had once pretended absence now had enough people who required its warmth to keep it honest. On a night when snow threatened and the lamps winked in windows, Richard received a parcel in the post, a small book of poems with a note from his father. The letter was brittle with the impatience of a man who had always found speech as a tool to test rather than to soothe. He had written few things on paper. In this one he said, in a manner that was more admission than apology, that he had been proud of Richard in ways he did not say aloud, and that pride had been complicated by fear of having been too late. Richard read the lines twice. He felt the old complicated currents under his feet, the narrow trenches of blame and the wider river of time that could wash and smooth. He answered briefly, in a hand that trembled not from rage, but from the acknowledgment of softness. He wrote no lecture. He wrote thanks. He did not expect miracles. He wanted, in the smallest honest way, to close the ground between them. When spring came again, lighter now, with pale buds like promises set to be tested, Emma celebrated a small recital at the school on the hill. Richard sat in the second row, not staged in his presence, but steady, hands in his lap. Maria sat to his right, fingers braided through a small purse strap, eyes shining in a way that held both pride and a careful restraint. Emma's voice was small at first, then found its width in the second verse. When she finished, she bowed with a seriousness that had been fostered by months of ordinary tending. Afterwards, outside, some of the parents lingered, and one of them, noticing Richard's steadiness, spoke of an opening at the community center, where they were looking for someone to help with after-school crafts. It was a small thing. Richard accepted. He found that the work with children, showing how to tie yarn, how to sand a wooden spoon, how to listen, fit into the slow architecture of what he was learning. To be present, he discovered, was not a single great act, but 1,000 tiny ones. There were days, even then, when the old voice returned like a weather tide, sharp and claiming. He would wake in the night and measure his faults as if they were debts. But the measure had shifted. He had developed a counter-ritual. He would sit up, make a small list of what had been mended, write one thing he could do for the morning, call Maria if he needed help, attend the piano lesson, fix the hinge on the attic door. These were not grand absolutions, but the slow arithmetic of repair. Over time, the nights softened because there were more acts balanced on the other side.
The house continued to hold its small miracles. Friends married and left tiny bundles at the door. A neighbor boy learned to read under the lamplight at the kitchen table and could not stop saying the names of the letters as if they were new friends. Maria's corner in the market became known for its patience. Women brought daughters who didn't want their hair brushed, and Maria hummed while she worked and never hurried them. Emma, now older and capable of braiding for others, sometimes sat at Maria's stall and offered to tie a ribbon. People watched them together and saw not merely the exchange of services, but the passing on of a temperament, gentleness, practiced and taught. One evening, as summer leaned toward its close and the light slipped long across the lawn, Richard sat at the kitchen table with Emma on his knee. She had been talking about an idea to plant sunflowers along the fence so bees and children could see each other more clearly. Maria moved in and out of the room, stacking plates and folding napkins, humming a line of some song whose words had slipped from her memory. Richard reached for Emma's hair and began, as he had done for months, to braid. His fingers had the surety of habit now, an ease that came from repetition and from love that did not ask for proof. As he crossed one strand over the other, Emma watched him with a seriousness that had nothing of fear. The braid grew thick and long, a rope of small choices woven into a single thing. When he finished, he held it out to her. She took it solemnly and looked up at him, the way she had on the day she had first handed him a braid, as if offering some piece of herself to be kept. "Thank you," she said, and it was a gratitude that sat alongside competence, a pair of things that seemed in that moment to be as necessary as sun and bread. Richard kissed the top of her head. The house hummed around them. Cups cooling, a radio playing a station that had been on all afternoon, the habitual patter of pages being turned. He thought of all the small labors that had led here, apologies that were kept by action, mornings attended, toys mended, calls returned. None of it had been spectacular. None of it had erased past wrongs as if they were chalk marks wiped clean.